Hello there, I'm Nathan from Ivy League Mentors, and today we're going to talk about cross-text connection questions on the digital SAT. You may know them as double passage questions or paired passage questions. I'm talking about the ones that require you to read two passages on a similar subject and to answer a question based on both of them. Now, if you are like most students I've encountered in my 15 plus years of teaching the SAT, you probably hate these questions with a fiery passion. But don't worry, I've got you covered. In this video, we're going to discuss 4 simple steps that you can use to solve these questions quickly, confidently, and best of all, correctly. And then we'll practice applying them on questions of increasing difficulty, including some of the hardest questions to ever appear on the digital SAT. So let's get started. Step 1. Analyze the question. Now, when I say analyze the question, what I mean is to read the question carefully and determine 2 key things: what you're going to need to know and where it's going to be located. This step is important because it will tell you what to focus on when you're reading the texts, which will allow you to approach them more efficiently. Let's try that together with a simple example. Based on the texts, how would Singh and Roy, text 2, most likely respond to the research discussed in text 1? So what are we going to need to know to answer this question? Well, pretty clearly, we're going to need to know the research discussed in text 1. And then, in text 2, we're going to need to know the views of Singh and Roy in order to determine how they would respond to that research. Now that we've established that, we can move on to step 2. Read strategically.
Mr. Greenberg! Mr. Greenberg!
Hello there, student me.
Does that mean I need to read both passages? Because that would take forever.
Well, student me, I have good news for you. You don't necessarily need to read all of both texts, and you certainly don't need to pay a lot of attention to every detail. Reading strategically means reading with a goal in mind, and there is only one goal you should have in mind when you're reading these passages: to answer the question. Therefore, when you read, you should be focusing on finding and understanding the information you'll need to answer the question, and disregarding everything else. Let's return to our sample question to see how that works. Remember, the question was asking us how Singh and Roy, in text 2, would most likely respond to the research discussed in text 1. Therefore, when reading text 1, we need to focus on understanding the research. Let's try that right now. Public policy researcher Anthony Fowler studied the history of elections in Australia, a country that requires citizens to vote. Fowler argues that requiring citizens to vote leads to a significant increase in voters who would otherwise not have the time or motivation to vote. Thus, election results in countries that require citizens to vote better reflect the preferences of the country as a whole. So what does this research suggest? Well, the main point seems to be that requiring citizens to vote leads to better results. Now that we've established that, let's move on to text 2. And this time we're going to focus on finding and understanding the views of Singh and Roy. Governments in democratic countries function better when more people vote. However, forcing people to vote may have negative consequences. Shane P. Singh and Jason Roy studied what happens when a country requires its citizens to vote. They found that when people feel forced to vote, they tend to spend less time looking for information about their choices when voting. As a result, votes from these voters may not reflect their actual preferences. Now, what can we infer about the views of Singh and Roy? Their study found that people who are required to vote may not be well informed and may make bad decisions as a result. Therefore, we can infer that they would not be fans of requiring people to vote. Now that we've got that covered, let's move on to step 3. Formulate an answer. Now, I know you may be tempted to jump to the answer choices at this point, but if you can't formulate a rough answer to the question, you probably won't be able to recognize the correct answer when you see it. So let's try that. How would Singh and Roy most likely respond to the research discussed in text 1? Well, we've basically figured it out already. It's pretty clear that they would disagree with the conclusion that requiring citizens to vote leads to better election results, because their own research shows that it actually may lead to worse results. And now that we've established that, we can move on to step 4. Analyze the answer choices. What I mean is to read the answer choices carefully, looking for something that matches your own rough answer. If you can find it, it's probably right. But if nothing jumps out to you, try eliminating answers that are obviously wrong. Remember that our prediction was that they would disagree with the conclusion because, according to their research, requiring citizens to vote can lead to worse outcomes. So let's check the answer choices and see if we can find something like that, starting with A. Only countries of a certain population size should implement mandatory voting. Now, Singh and Roy were against mandatory voting, but their conclusion had nothing to do with population size. Therefore, this answer can safely be eliminated. We move on to B. People who are forced to vote are likely to become politically engaged in other ways, such as volunteering or running for office. Now, this answer choice would suggest that requiring people to vote actually has a positive impact by motivating them to get engaged in other ways, which clearly goes against the views of Singh and Roy, so it can be eliminated too. We move on to C. Requiring people to vote does not necessarily lead to election outcomes that better represent the preferences of the country as a whole. Now, here's an answer choice that suggests that requiring people to vote could actually lead to a worse outcome, which is exactly what we predicted. Therefore, we can pick answer C with confidence. Now, this was not a hard question. According to the College Board, it was a 1 out of 3 in terms of difficulty. But these same basic steps should be able to work on any cross-text connection question, no matter how difficult. So let's try them together on a slightly harder example. This one is rated a 2 out of 3. Again, let's start by reading the question and assessing the goal. Based on the text, Vieira's team and the author of text 2 would most likely agree with which statement about microbes. Based on this question, it's pretty clear that when we read the texts, what we need to be focusing on is some kind of statement that we could make about microbes. So let's read strategically with that in mind, starting with text 1. Microbes are tiny organisms in the soil, water, and air all around us. They thrive even in very harsh conditions. That's why Noah Vieira and colleagues were surprised when soil samples they collected from an extremely cold, dry area in Antarctica didn't seem to contain any life. The finding doesn't prove that there are no microbes in that area, but the team says it does suggest that the environment severely restricts microbe survival. So what do Vieira and colleagues think about microbes? Well, we know that they found a surprising result, which is that in this area of Antarctica where they collected the samples, there are either no or very few microbes compared to other places. Now let's move on to text 2, and again we're going to read this strategically, focusing on what the author would think about microbes. Microbes are found in virtually every environment on Earth, so it's unlikely that they would be completely absent from Vieira's team's study site, no matter how extreme the environment is. There were probably so few organisms in the samples that current technology couldn't detect them. But since a spoonful of typical soil elsewhere might contain billions of microbes, the presence of so few in the Antarctic soil samples would show how challenging the conditions are. So in this case, text 2 is actually discussing the findings of text 1. It disagrees with the idea that there are no microbes in this soil, but it does admit that there are surprisingly few, and like text 1, it seems to think that this is because of the challenging conditions there. Now that we've read the text and understood the key parts, we're ready to move on to step 3, which is to formulate our own answer. Now, because we've read the text well, we've practically done this already. The texts may disagree about whether there were no microbes or just a very small number of microbes in these particular samples, but they both agree that there was a much smaller number of microbes in these samples than usual, and they both attribute this to the harsh conditions in Antarctica. Therefore, we're going to look for an answer that reflects these views. Now we can examine the answer choices one by one, starting with A. Most microbes are better able to survive in environments with extremely dry conditions than in environments with harsh temperatures. Now, in this particular case, they were talking about the difficulty of microbes surviving in environments that are both cold and extremely dry. But there's no comparison about cold versus dry environments, so this one can be ruled out fairly easily. We move on to B. A much higher number of microbes would probably be found if another sample of soil were taken from the Antarctic study site. Now, both texts seem to agree that although there may be some microbes in this soil, there are not very many because of the harsh conditions. Therefore, it is unlikely that they would expect to find significantly more microbes in another sample from the same site. We can rule out this answer too, and move on to answer C. Microbes are likely difficult to detect in the soil at the Antarctic study site because they tend to be smaller than microbes found in typical soil elsewhere. Now, this answer may be tempting because the first part looks correct. Both texts would support the idea that microbes are difficult to detect in the soil at this Antarctic test site. However, it's not because they're too small. It's simply because there are not enough of them. Therefore, answer C can be eliminated, leaving us with answer D. Now at this point we know that answer D is going to be our answer, but let's read through it just to confirm that. Most microbes are probably unable to withstand the soil conditions at the Antarctic study site. Remember that our prediction was that both texts support the idea that there are fewer or possibly even no microbes in this particular site in Antarctica because of the harsh conditions. And answer D fits that prediction perfectly, confirming that it is indeed the correct answer. Now that we've mastered the basic steps, I think we're ready for some more difficult practice. The remaining questions in this video are all going to be level 3 out of 3 in terms of difficulty. However, if we apply the same steps, we should still be able to get to the correct answer. Let's jump into it. Based on the text, both Sykes in text 1 and the scholars in text 2 would most likely agree with which statement. So this question could be a little bit difficult because it doesn't give us something precise to look for. However, we do know that we should be focusing our attention on finding a similarity between the two texts, and so let's read them strategically with that in mind, starting with text 1. In 1916, H. Dugdale Sykes disputed claims that The Two Noble Kinsmen was co-authored by William Shakespeare and John Fletcher. Sykes felt Fletcher's contributions to the play were obvious. Fletcher had a distinct style in his other plays, so much so that lines with that style were considered sufficient evidence of Fletcher's authorship. But for the lines not deemed to be by Fletcher, Sykes felt that their depiction of women indicated that their author was not Shakespeare, but Philip Massinger. So this text seems to be providing an interpretation of the play The Two Noble Kinsmen, and specifically it's covering the views of this guy Sykes, who thinks that the play was co-authored not by Fletcher and Shakespeare, but by Fletcher and Massinger. Let's keep that in mind as we approach the next text. Scholars have accepted The Two Noble Kinsmen as co-authored by Shakespeare since the 1970s. It appears in all major one-volume editions of Shakespeare's complete works. Though scholars disagree about who wrote what exactly, it is generally held on the basis of style that Shakespeare wrote all of the first act and most of the last, while John Fletcher authored most of the 3 middle acts. So this text presents a somewhat different view on The Two Noble Kinsmen. It agrees that the play was co-authored and that one of those authors was Fletcher, but unlike the previous text, which believed that the other author was Massinger, this one suggests that the other author was Shakespeare. Now with this in mind, it still may be difficult to make an exact prediction, but one commonality that I've noticed between the texts is that they both involve the role of Fletcher in the creation of this play, The Two Noble Kinsmen. So let's try to work with that and begin examining our answer choices carefully, starting off with A. John Fletcher's writing has a unique, readily identifiable style.
Mr. Greenberg! Mr. Greenberg!
What is it, student me?
There's absolutely no way the answer is A, because text 2 doesn't say anything about Fletcher having a unique or identifiable style.
That may be true, student me, but the question isn't asking what the texts say. It's asking what the authors of the text would most likely agree on. That phrase most likely is important because it signals that the answer is probably not going to be something mentioned specifically in the text. Rather, it's something that we're going to need to use our inference skills to determine. Now back to these texts. Text 2 might not talk about Fletcher having a distinct style, but it agrees that on the basis of style, Fletcher wrote at least some of this play. And if Fletcher didn't have a distinct style, how would they be able to tell that? The fact that they are able to identify that certain parts were written by Fletcher on the basis of style is proof that Fletcher must have a distinctive and identifiable style. So yeah, this time we got lucky and found our answer right away. It's A. Let's move on to the next question. As usual, we'll start by reading the question. Based on the text, how would Behrenfeld and colleagues, text 2, most likely respond to the conventional wisdom discussed in text 1? So to read text 1 strategically, what I need to focus on is understanding the conventional wisdom. Let's try that. Ecologists have long wondered how thousands of microscopic phytoplankton species can live together near ocean surfaces, competing for the same resources. According to conventional wisdom, one species should emerge after outcompeting the rest. So why do so many species remain? Ecologists' many efforts to explain this phenomenon still haven't uncovered a satisfactory explanation. So now that we've read text 1, let's do a quick comprehension check and make sure that we've understood the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom seems to be that it doesn't make sense for so many different species of phytoplankton to be competing for the same resources, because in most cases, one species should emerge as dominant and outcompete the rest. Now let's move on to text 2 and try to figure out what Barenfeld and colleagues would think about this conventional wisdom. Ecologist Michael Barenfeld and colleagues have connected phytoplankton's diversity to their microscopic size. Because these organisms are so tiny, they are spaced relatively far apart from each other in the ocean water, and, moreover, experience that water as a relatively dense substance. This in turn makes it hard for them to move around and interact with one another. Therefore, says Barenfeld's team, direct competition among phytoplankton probably happens much less than previously thought. Now remember that the conventional wisdom was that these different species of phytoplankton are going to compete together, and that one of them should emerge as dominant. Barenfeld seems to disagree with that because his study found that competition between these happens a lot less than was previously thought. Therefore, if we had to formulate our own answer, it would be that Barenfeld and colleagues would disagree with the conventional wisdom because they don't think that phytoplankton actually competes that much. Now we can move on to the answer choices and examine them looking for a match, starting as usual with A, by arguing that it is based on a misconception about phytoplankton species competing with one another. Remember that our prediction was that Barenfeld and colleagues disagree with the conventional wisdom because they think that in the case of phytoplankton, there isn't actually very much competition going on. This answer seems to reflect that perfectly because it tells us that the conventional wisdom is wrong based upon a misconception, and specifically that misconception is about phytoplankton competing, when in fact, they think that they don't really compete very much. Therefore, it looks again like we've gotten very lucky and stumbled upon our correct answer right away. The correct answer is, in fact, A. Let's move on to another question. As usual, we'll begin by reading it. Based on the texts, the author of text 1 and the author of text 2 would most likely give the same answer to which question? So again, this is kind of vague, so I'm not really sure what to look for, but one thing I should focus my attention on as I'm reading the text is a similarity, because we're looking for something that both authors would agree on. So let's approach the text with that in mind, starting off with text 1. In separate studies, Lingbo Meng and colleagues and Xinhua He and colleagues examined whether plant transfer nutrients to one another using a common mycorrhizal network, CMN, a lattice of fungal strands in the soil. Meng and colleagues excluded all pathways other than the CMN by using barriers to keep the plant's root system separate, while allowing mycorrhizal strands through, a crucial step that he and colleagues' study did not take. So this text seems to be discussing two studies, one by Meng and one by He. And it seems to think that Meng and colleagues did a good job by excluding all other types of pathways. It also suggests that He and colleagues did not do a great job because they forgot to take this crucial step. Now let's move on to text number 2. Meng and colleagues took the necessary precaution of separating the plant's root systems, thereby excluding root-to-root transmission. However, any barrier used must allow a thread-like hyphae of the CMN to pass through, and this permeability would also allow liquids through. Thus, the researchers' experimental design cannot ensure that any nutrient transfer observed can be attributed to a CMN and not to some other pathway. So this text also seems to be discussing the study by Meng and colleagues, but it has a rather different view of it. Although it acknowledges that Meng and colleagues took an important step by excluding root-to-root transmission, it still feels that Meng and colleagues didn't do a perfect job overall, because they failed to exclude other types of transmission that might interfere with the results. Given this, formulating our own answer to the question may be a little bit challenging. We know that overall, the authors have different opinions on the study by Meng and colleagues. However, one commonality is that they both think that this step of excluding the root-to-root transmission, which Meng took, was important. So maybe we can work with that. Let's examine the answer choices with that idea in mind, starting as usual with answer A. Remember, we're looking for a question that both authors would give the same answer to. Did He and colleagues' study effectively exclude any nutrient pathway other than a CMN?
But Mr. Greenberg, there's no way A can be the answer. Text 2 doesn't even talk about he and colleagues.
Oh, student me, have you been paying attention at all? Just a few minutes ago, I was explaining that if the question uses the phrase most likely, the correct answer may not be explicitly stated in the text itself. That's a clue that we're going to need to use our inference skills. Now, you are absolutely right that text 2 doesn't mention anything at all about he and colleagues, but it does tell us that Meng and colleagues took the necessary precaution of excluding root-to-root transmission. And we know from text 1 that he and colleagues did not take this step, which the author of text 2 deems to be so important. Therefore, both authors would clearly agree that he and colleagues did not take steps to effectively exclude any other type of pathway. This means that we've gotten lucky one more time and stumbled upon the correct answer in our first try. The answer is A. Let's move on to the next question. As usual, we'll start by reading. Based on the texts, how would the author of text 2 most likely respond to the assertion in the underlined portion of text 1?
Mr. Greenberg! Mr. Greenberg!
What is it, student me?
Does that mean that I only need to read the underlined portion?
In some cases, it may be, but there's a good chance that you'll need to read more of the text in order to properly understand the underlined part. In general, when you see this type of question, my advice for you would be to quickly read through the whole text, but to focus your attention primarily on the underlined part. Let's try that right now. Growth in the use of novel nanohybrids, materials created from the conjugation of multiple distinct nanomaterials, such as iron oxide and gold nanomaterials conjugated for use in magnetic imaging, has outpaced studies of nanohybrids' environmental risks. Unfortunately, risk evaluations based on nanohybrids' constituents are not reliable. Conjugation may alter constituents' physiochemical properties, such that innocuous nanomaterials form a nanohybrid that is anything but.
Mr. Greenberg, gotta be honest here. I have no idea what any of that means.
I hear you, student me. The vocab in this sentence is tough, and it's going to pose a major obstacle for a lot of students, so let me break it down for you. The text is talking about the conjugation, or combination, of nanomaterials. And specifically, it's saying that nanomaterials that are innocuous or harmless could be combined or conjugated to form a compound or nanohybrid that is anything but. In other words, anything but innocuous. In other words, harmful. Let me put that even more simply. They're saying that combining two different nanomaterials to make a nanohybrid could be dangerous, even if the separate components are not harmful on their own. Now that we've got that, let's move on to the second text, focusing on what the author of text 2 would say about this. The potential for enhanced toxicity of nanohybrids relative to the toxicity of constituent nanomaterials has drawn deserved attention, but the effects of nanomaterial conjugation vary by case. For instance, it was recently shown that a nanohybrid of silicon dioxide and zinc oxide preserved the desired optical transparency of zinc oxide nanoparticles while mitigating the nanoparticles' potential to damage DNA. Now, based on this, it seems that the author of text 2 partially agrees with the claim in the underlined portion, because he admits that the potential for enhanced toxicity of nanohybrids has drawn deserved attention. In other words, we should be paying attention to this risk. However, that's where the agreement stops, because the author of text 2 is careful to point out that the effects of nanomaterial conjunction, and again, that means combining two nanomaterials to make a nanohybrid, varies case by case. And then he provides an example where combining two different nanomaterials results in a nanohybrid that's actually less harmful. So if I had to formulate my own answer to this question, it would be that while there may be some risk to combining these nanomaterials, that risk is not always going to be there, and that in some cases it may be perfectly fine. Now let's examine the answer choices and see if we can find something that matches that, starting as usual with A, by concurring that the risk described in text 1 should be evaluated, but emphasizing that the risk is more than offset by the potential benefits of nanomaterial conjugation. Now this is an answer that looks pretty close to what we predicted. The author of text 2 would certainly agree that the risk described in text 1 needs to be evaluated, because he says it's drawn deserved attention. The author also suggests that at least in some cases, nanomaterial conjugation can have some benefits. At least that's what his example suggests. Therefore, we may be tempted to pick answer A. But there is a problem. Although the author concedes that there may be risks and benefits to nanoconjugation, the author of text 2 never says that the risk is more than offset by those benefits. Rather, he says that it's something that must be examined on a case-by-case basis. Therefore, A is actually false and it can be eliminated. Let's move on to answer B. By arguing that the situation described in text 1 may not be representative, but conceding that the effects of nanomaterial conjugation are harder to predict than researchers had expected. So the first part of this answer choice is looking pretty good. The author would indeed argue that the situation described in text 1, this increased risk of nanomaterial conjugation, may not be representative because he says it doesn't apply in all cases. However, that last part about the effects of it being hard to predict don't seem to match what we saw before. The author doesn't talk at all about it being easy or difficult to predict. He just talks about it being something that we need to study on a case-by-case basis. Therefore, answer B can be eliminated, and we move on to C. By denying that the circumstance described in text 1 is likely to occur, but acknowledging that many aspects of nanomaterial conjugation are still poorly understood. So here's an answer choice that we can probably eliminate just from the first part alone. The author tells us that the circumstance described in text 1 has drawn deserved attention, and therefore he seems to think that it's something that could legitimately occur, even if it doesn't occur in all cases. Therefore, he certainly wouldn't deny that it's likely to occur. We only have one answer choice left, and based on process of elimination, it has to be the correct one. But let's examine D carefully just to confirm that suspicion. By agreeing that the possibility described in text 1 is a cause for concern, but pointing out that nanomaterial conjugation does not inevitably produce that result. Well, as we've discussed, the author certainly would agree that this possibility is a cause for concern because he says it's drawn deserved attention. But he also mentions that this is not something that always happens. Rather, it only happens in certain cases. And so he would also agree that it's not something that will inevitably happen. Therefore, answer D checks out and we can pick it with confidence. Now we're going to solve one final question, but before we do that, a quick public service announcement. I've written a textbook, Digital SAT Reading and Writing, The Ultimate Guide. Now I may be a little bit biased, but I'm pretty sure that it's one of the best resources out there when it comes to preparing for the reading and writing section of the Digital SAT. I'll leave a link in the description so that you can buy your own copy, along with a promo code that you can use to get 25% off your purchase. Now back to the video. Based on the texts, how would Chris Brierly, text 2, most likely respond to the discussion in text 1? So this question tells us that when we read text 1, we need to focus our attention on understanding the basic discussion. Let's try that right now. Africa's Sahara region, once a lush ecosystem, began to dry out about 8,000 years ago. A change in Earth's orbit that affected climate has been posited as a cause of desertification. But archaeologist David Wright also attributes the shift to Neolithic peoples. He cites their adoption of pastoralism as a factor in the region drying out. The pastoralists' livestock depleted vegetation, prompting the events that created the Sahara Desert. So this discussion appears to be about what caused the Sahara Desert to emerge about 8,000 years ago. Scientists seem to agree that a change in Earth's orbit was one of the reasons. But this guy David Wright also seems to think that pastoralism, or people farming livestock, was also a cause. That the depletion of vegetation caused by these people moving in with their pastoral lifestyles exacerbated the climate change and caused the Sahara Desert to emerge. Now let's move on to text 2 and try to figure out what Chris Brierly would say about all of this. Research by Chris Brierly et al. Challenges the idea that Neolithic peoples contributed to the Sahara's desertification. Using a climate vegetation model, the team concluded that the end of the region's humid period occurred 500 years earlier than previously assumed. The timing suggests that Neolithic peoples didn't exacerbate aridity in the region, but in fact may have helped delay environmental changes with practices, e.g. selective grazing, that preserved vegetation. Now, the first sentence of this text makes it very clear that Chris Brierley does not agree with the idea that Neolithic peoples contributed to the forming of the Sahara Desert. His reasoning is based on inconsistencies in timing, that the Sahara Desert started drying out 500 years before previously assumed, and therefore the arrival of these people might have actually made it better rather than making it worse. So if I had to put this all together and formulate my own answer, it's that Chris Brierley would disagree with the idea that Neolithic peoples contributed to the desertification of the Sahara, because he thinks the timeline doesn't match. Now let's examine the answer choices one by one and see if we can find something that fits, starting off as usual with A. By pointing out that given the revised timeline for the end of the Sahara's humid period, the Neolithic people's mode of subsistence likely didn't cause the region's desertification. Remember that our prediction was that he would disagree with the idea that Neolithic people caused the desertification of the Sahara because of a dispute about the timeline. Answer A seems to give us exactly what we're looking for, and it is, in fact, the correct answer to this question. Once again, we've gotten lucky. We found the correct answer on the first try, and we don't need to mess around by reading through the other answer choices because we've already located a perfect match. The correct answer is, in fact, A. Those were some hard questions, but I think that when we apply these 4 simple steps, they're not so bad. What do you think? And for those of you who are trying along at home, how many did you manage to get right? Let me know about it in the comments. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks as always for watching, and good luck on the test.